A Queensland parliamentary committee has backed controversial legislation that will make it possible for people to change the gender on their birth certificate in line with their personal identity. Under the Births, Deaths and Marriages Registration Bill, people as young as 16 will be able to apply to change the sex on their birth certificate with just a statutory declaration. No sex change surgery required. The bill defines gender as a person's internal and individual experience of gender, whether or not it corresponds with the sex assigned to the person at birth. End quote. Joining me to discuss what this means is Professor Patrick Parkinson. Professor, great to have you with us. Can you tell me, this legislation essentially enshrines in law the idea that people are not born male or female, but instead have an inherent gender identity that may or may not align with their autonomy. Have I got that right?
Pretty much. What it does is it allows you to change your birth certificate. And so you can say that you were born male, but you can change to be female and vice versa. But also you can say, oh, I was born genderqueer or I was born agender. So it allows you to essentially choose any gender identity that you like and then say that's how you were born. But common sense will tell us that's not how you were born. When we know from ultrasounds in the womb what sex a child is. And so this is a profoundly unscientific sort of law.
And yet codified, as you said, in law if this bill goes through. The government committee noted concerns about women's safety and what this decision means for women's sports, but decided to ignore those concerns. Why?
Well, let me first of all explain what impact this is going to have on women's safety and women's sports. There are no exemptions or almost no exemptions in the Act. And so what that means is that a male who registers as a female will be entitled to enter into any female single-sex space, into the women's changing rooms at the public swimming pool, into a women's refuge even, and they'll be allowed to engage in women's sports because the exemptions which are currently there in the Anti-Discrimination Act are not being extended to this new characteristic of this new attribute of sex characteristics. So what that means is essentially that women's gyms, to take an example, will not be able to exclude males who are registered as female. And think about the implications of this for, say, swimming pools, public changing rooms. We don't go around asking people for their birth certificates. So if a man is there in the women's changing room, it's very difficult to say they shouldn't be there. That's the implications of all of this. That affects women's safety. But at a more fundamental level, it affects women's bodily privacy and the bodily privacy of girls too. They will be unable to say no to a male who's in their changing rooms.
So, Professor, just back to my question, why have the committee ignored this? Why are these concerns that you're articulating not seen as primary?
Queensland only has one house. It has no upper house. And the committees are controlled by the backbenchers of the government of the day. So essentially, although there was opposition in the committee, although there were dissenting viewpoints, the Labour backbenchers controlled it, and they have done what Anastasia Palaszczuk wants them to do, what Shannon Fentiman, the Attorney General, wants them to do, and that is support government policy without amendment. So in that sense, the committee is just a rubber stamp.
It's pretty confusing times. I was at Sydney Airport on the weekend and my 18-year-old son said to me, and he was asking seriously, he said, "Dad, if I went into the women's toilets, would I get kicked out?" And the honest answer was, we weren't sure. And then I spoke with the security person as you go through security at the airport, and I was asking her how all this works in Sydney, and she wasn't exactly sure, except she said, if I told her I identified as a woman, therefore she would have to pat me down, whether or not she wanted to or not. So it's pretty strange times. We've seen in Scotland where former First Minister Nicola Sturgeon was pushing self-identity laws, but then she got into an awful tangle because it was revealed a man convicted of 2 rapes had been sent to a women's prison after self-identifying as female. So we've been watching all of that play out overseas. Are Australian lawmakers ignorant of developments overseas?
Yes and no. In the Queensland bill, at least there is some provision around prisoners. Somebody who's currently in jail will need the permission of the head of prisons to be able to apply to change their gender identity. So we won't have the Scottish situation quite the same way in Queensland, but if they have changed their gender identity and registered as female before they are committed to prison, then they'll have to be placed in women's jails. And it's not just Scotland, James. There are shocking things happening all over the Western world now, in Ireland, in Canada, particularly the Anglophone countries, where seriously dangerous men, multiple sex offenders, are being placed in women's jails. It is beyond extraordinary.
Professor, just quickly, we don't have much time left, but I wanted to ask you about education. The Australian Law Reform Commission is due to report back just in a couple of weeks regarding what anti-discrimination laws should be applied to religious schools. In the draft paper, the Commission acknowledged the importance of religious education and parental rights, but effectively argued to undermine both. Just very quickly, can you summarise for me what the Commission is expected to recommend and why it's bad for parents and for faith-based schools?
Well, we certainly don't know what the Commission's going to recommend. There's been a real pushback against their proposals. And it was only a paper written by the staff and some consultants, not by the commissioners themselves. But what it does is it goes against Labour government policy. Labour government policy is that the exemptions around sexual orientation and gender identity should be removed from schools for both students and staff. Well, it implements that. Not very well, but it does. But the government has also said that faith-based schools should be able to prefer people of the same faith for their teaching jobs and their other jobs. And the Law Reform Commission has gone way beyond that and said, no, we're going to restrict that as well. It has to be a genuine occupational requirement. We're going to police through the courts who you can employ and restrict your right to employ Christian staff for a Christian school. That's what's going on. And it's happening in the States as well.
Certainly interesting time for Christian schools. Professor Parkinson, thank you for your time.